Welcome, everybody. We are in the third installment of our first month of the series, March on Milwaukee, a digital history series. We are obviously wanting to take part in the process by which we provide more and more opportunities for learning in the digital sphere. And we will continue these conversations monthly. Today, though, we've got some pretty awesome folks to help us further contextualize the open housing marches here in Milwaukee in the late 60s. In fact, we have the two scholars who really helped to situate, contextualize, and tell those stories and share those narratives of this really important upsurge in Milwaukee history and civil rights history. I don't know how we could do this. I want to unlock everybody's microphone because I really want to make sure that Erica Metcalf, Patrick Jones, that they get a big round of applause. So I'm going to give them a round of applause. Welcome. You know, we've got Patrick Jones out of the University of Nebraska. Patrick, I believe you are from Cleveland, Ohio. Is that right?
Yeah, born in Baltimore and then grew up in Cleveland. Went to Madison for grad school.
Awesome, awesome. Welcome. We're glad to have you today, author of Selma of the North, Civil Rights Insurgency in Milwaukee. And then, of course, we have one of Milwaukee's own daughters here. We've got Erica Metcalf, a Riverside grad, I believe a Marquette alumna as well. Is that correct?
No, University of Wisconsin, Milwaukee.
I was definitely getting to that one. I knew that one for sure. I wasn't sure if you were an undergrad at Marquette or not, but welcome, Erica. Thank you so much for joining us. It's always great to have you because of not only your research, but your long-term awareness and experience of Milwaukee, Wisconsin. It's always a pleasure. Welcome.
Thank you.
Well, folks, here's what we're going to do today. We've been working through a process by which we use images to help tell this story so that we can obviously give our young people who take part in these conversations the opportunity to play with some primary documents, but the images themselves help to tell the story. So we're gonna move forward in three chunks to help with the classroom experience. The first chunk of today, and I want to thank Keisha. Keisha's in the background running our PowerPoint for us, as well as Kristen and Heather, folks who've been a part of this, of developing this process for us. And Keisha, you can go to the next slide. The first chunk that we're going to do is look through some images. We're going to use some images to help instigate our conversation and initiate our conversation. We'll get our scholars talking about some of those images. Adam Carr is over there. Adam, oh, sorry about that, man. It is all about me, but I'll let you introduce yourself. Why don't you tell us who you are, big guy?
Just briefly, I do a variety of work around Milwaukee. I work behind the scenes at Milwaukee Neighborhood News Service, do writing, film, photography, and probably the honor of my whole life has been working on the 50th anniversary of the open housing marches, which, much like the marches, is lasting much longer than we thought it would. We're into year 52, I think, and this is still a major part of my life. So happy to be here.
Well, thank you, man. It's always a pleasure to work with you. So Adam's gonna take control in just a second. He's gonna walk us through, and our panelists through this conversation around some of these very rich photos that help to tell the story. So that's gonna be our first 15 or so minutes. Our second chunking, our second 15 minutes, we are going to give our scholars the opportunity to talk a little bit about how they research and teach these important histories, just so that we get a chance to hear from them and learn a little bit about their craft. And then we'll open it up right away for Q&A in that third 15-minute chunk so that we can get folks in the conversation. However, we do not in any way expect for the 33 plus folks who've attended with us today to wait until that Q&A. This is the awesome part about doing these kinds of conversations. You can drop questions into the chat. You can give us a whole range of thoughts and comments along the way so that we can make this as engaging and dynamic of a conversation. We are also on Facebook, so feel free to do your thing on Facebook as well, folks, and we will move back and forth between the two and see if we can keep everybody's comments and questions in the mix. Just know there is about a 10-second lag on Facebook, so if we get to something a little bit later, that's just because of that timing. For the panelists, can you please make sure for your chat to change it to all panelists and all attendees if you want the attendees to hear from you in that way. They'll be giving us information, and so if you respond, just make sure that they can see your comments as well. All right, Adam, you ready to get started?
Yeah, let's do it.
All right. First 15-minute chunk, let's look at some of these images and get our experts warmed up on this topic.
So these are some images that I know both of you have engaged with, have used actively. Wanted to start with a set of images that show the Youth Council, the Commandos, Father Grappi, and this image in particular highlights the cause that they marched around, the one that was kind of the spark that lit the fire here in Milwaukee, which is open housing, ending housing segregation. These are just some images, both shared with us from Dr. Metcalf and Dr. Jones. These are just some of the images that we have, and I'm gonna just scroll through the first handful of these, and then we can go back and center on some. Actually, that's as far as we're gonna go for this first set. And let us just start with this image. Do you guys want to share a little bit of what you're seeing when you're looking at this image? I know it's one that's become kind of iconic.
Oh, well, for me, I think this is, one of the most powerful photos of the movement. We see the marchers holding up the American flag. You see Father Grappi is in there marching. I think it can be interpreted in a number of ways, this photo. I think you can interpret this photograph as, the marchers making a plea to their nation to say, it's time for the country to really live up to its democratic ideals and really embrace equity for everyone, not just some. But then on the other hand, I think you can kind of interpret it as patriotism to a certain extent, of them saying, you know what, we are Americans and we have the right to march and we're entitled to all the rights that come with being an American, and that includes access to decent and fair housing in this country. So yeah, to me, it's just always been an especially powerful photo because of the marchers holding up the American flag and all that that symbolizes.
To poorly paraphrase James Baldwin, one of the sort of quotes that we've kept in mind in our circle in Milwaukee through the course of the open housing marches anniversary is as an American, he reserves the right to perpetually criticize America. As someone who loves it, that's part of his expression of love, is the ability to express critique.
Exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, I would just add to that, seconding what Dr. Metcalf said, and then also adding a couple of other things. So there's definitely a situating of this Northern movement within a broader freedom struggle, American freedom struggle and Black freedom struggle history. And when I started doing this work, first as a grad student and then after and finishing the book up, folks were not writing about struggles for racial justice during the movement era beyond the South. And so it was important to try to, and one of my main goals as a scholar is to insert those kinds of Northern civil rights and Black power stories and to recast through that the national narrative and to assert that. In the popular kind of mythic sense of the Southern Black freedom movement, it is by some, at least today, a story that is told in kind of glorious terms of a movement that in a nation that ultimately acknowledged segregation and overcame it. That's a problematic narrative, but it's a kind of a triumphalist story, and it's embraced by many. And Northern movement stories hadn't been told. I'm gonna let my dog out here. But also, were often cast in problematic ways because of the way the story of Black power had been told. So I see in this too a kind of recasting of Northern movement story within that circle of the best tradition of protest and struggle for justice and racial justice. I also note here the interesting place that opens up for us with Father Grappi, surrounded by a number of commandos, and then others too, which allows us to begin to think about the peculiar place of this white Catholic priest who played an important public role in the movement there, and spurred much debate at the time and ongoing today. And then I would just say more broadly that, you know, my interest again is in trying to argue and assert the importance of the Northern movement and movements, and that they happen on a scale of the Southern campaigns and movements. So, you know, the open housing campaign in Milwaukee and white reaction to it, you know, we're talking thousands of people coming out, is on a scale that's at least as big, if not bigger, than iconic moments that we have placed in the national narrative in the South, Birmingham, Selma, Montgomery. But the vast majority of people today still don't remember Milwaukee. It still has not taken its rightful place in the national narrative. And I feel strongly that it should. And so, you know, why we have to ask that question, why don't we tell Northern movement stories? And what do we make of images like this when we don't really have a framework to make sense of them, right? They're compelling, but we don't really have a powerful, particularly in our schools often, framework to start to make sense of these really compelling and complicated, ultimately, images.
And Dr. Metcalf, that point you're making there, Dr. Jones, I would love to further explore, both of you obviously, but yourself as a Milwaukee Public Schools graduate, myself as a MPS graduate, these aren't stories that we heard. You know, these weren't every February. We probably should have gotten tired of hearing about the commandos and the youth council, but you know, they went virtually, they fell into obscurity. So let's move on to some of these images that you guys shared a little bit. Let's stick with this one a little bit. You guys want to take a crack at what's going on here?
Well, in this photo, we see the youth council facing off with Milwaukee police. And I think this is another very powerful photo, and it's symbolic for a number of reasons. I mean, just observing the body language, you know, you see the police and they're kind of on the defensive already. And meanwhile, the youth council is like, you know, standing there unbothered, they're fearless. And that's probably because, you know, they knew that the cause that they were fighting for was a righteous cause. But I think it's symbolic because it kind of shows us, or it's symbolic of the repression and the resistance that civil rights groups of that era faced. But on the other hand, it's also symbolic of the fearlessness and the bravery that these activists displayed in the face of that repression. So it's, as I said before, it's symbolic for various reasons. You can go beyond our local movement and find meaning in this photo.
You know, Dr. Metcalf, I really, this is my favorite image of all the many awesome images that help to chart this moment in civil rights and Milwaukee history. I love this image because of the tension that is present, particularly the tension in the open space. You know, you can just see the funneling of the clash in the backdrop, and it's almost like it's headed forward toward us.
Yeah.
Image. And as you mentioned, the stance of the youth council members in particular, the sort of fear and yet the bravery at the same time.
Yeah, I would this image in relationship to the previous image, you know, right, I think is really interesting, where the previous image, we have a kind of an image that fits within our tropes about the civil rights struggle. It's people marching, they're holding a flag, you know, right, it kind of leads you to that, as we were talking about, images of patriotism, a claim on the nation for equality, etc. Here we have an image that suggests something very different about the open housing campaign, which is the standoff and what I would call massive resistance of whites to a pretty basic assertion of of liberty and freedom by African Americans and their allies in Milwaukee. And we can see here helmeted police with nightsticks, and even towards the back, one already coming in to, perhaps level a blow. And it underscores a much more difficult dynamic of the open housing campaign in the Northern movement, which is this issue of massive resistance, which Dr. King acknowledged the year before this in Chicago when he was there working on this issue and marching into white ethnic working class neighborhoods and faced great violence and was hit in the face with a brick that in all his time in the South, he had seen much reaction and violence, but never so much anger and violence as he saw in Chicago. So another dynamic of this is that we have to grapple not only with this history, but in terms of making sense of its ongoing legacy and the persistence of urban inequality today and racial injustice in a place like Milwaukee and other cities across the nation, with the breadth and depth and persistence of white resistance. And so we see it here in a very bald way with the police, but it took all kinds of forms, from people moving further out to the suburbs, from city councils and school boards using their power to resist even the most basic efforts at racial change, to new organizations being created, to the presence of the Klan and neo-Nazis, letter writing campaign, a whole breadth of what we could call massive resistance, I think, in the North. So I think that last image and this one are really interesting together in helping us kind of be careful and not placing the Milwaukee story within a kind of triumphalist, Pollyannish narrative of the civil rights movement, that it kind of acknowledged the problem and it overcame it and we're all better for it, but that this was a deeply difficult struggle, that these activists faced great peril, and that in really overcoming racial injustice in the society then or today, I mean, there's quite a mountain to overcome, and we have not done that yet, clearly.
Absolutely.
So it's sometimes my role to sully the scholarly conversation that you all are having. We were talking about this in our pre-conversation. One thing that we've done in our efforts to get the folks in the community to see this as their story is we've handed people these images literally, physically, and said, make these into memes. Give us a caption. Make this come alive in your contemporary vernacular. We don't say that because that wouldn't.
Particularly with young people. Yeah.
Young people, absolutely. We've done this in the Vel Phillips Juvenile Detention Center. And this one led to one of my very favorite memes, which the young people wrote, "Nuck if you buck." Which they see it's about to go down, right? Like just in that one tight little phrase of contemporary understanding, "Nuck if you buck." Like, absolutely. Even if you don't know what "nuck if you buck" means, like,
you get it, right?
You get it, right.
Absolutely. Keisha in Command Central is telling us that we need to get ready to start moving to our second section, which will get us talking about your teaching and research process. But to help us move along that way, yeah, Adam, definitely keep showing us more images. I wanted to ask a question that I've been wanting to hear from both of you for years now around this. Part of what I like to do in the classroom with Milwaukee's civil rights history is talk about the open housing marches as this sort of rich blending of what we traditionally think about Southern civil rights activism with this rich and emerging sense of Black power radicalism. Like it comes together in Milwaukee in some very, very impressive ways. It kind of gives us a rich bridge from what would be that traditional civil rights, modern civil rights movement history into this much more radical Black power moment. What are your thoughts about that? Have I been wrong about that? I hope not.
No, I don't think you've been wrong about it. The Milwaukee movement was a very complex movement. It definitely blended, pieces of the Southern civil rights movement as well as the Black power movement. I mean, you had so much going on, you know what I mean? First of all, they did embrace Black power. They would chant Black power. Even Father Grappy would chant Black power. He would encourage Black power. That's what the commandos really were all about, creating some strong Black male leadership But at the same time, it was church-based. You know, it was based out of, but not based out of a Baptist church. It was based out of a Catholic church. So you have like, you know, those Catholic elements in there. Their advisor was a white man. So it was integrated at the same time. And there were white youth council members and such. So it was definitely a very complex, diverse movement that blended all of those elements. I think you're exactly right in seeing the movement that way.
Well, and I got it from you too, so.
I mean, I think that's one of the most important and one of the most exciting dynamics of the Milwaukee history in particular, and Northern movement history more broadly, is that it really helps us, you know, we have set this kind of popular narrative of the civil rights era, and it's regionally based, and it's kind of triumphalist, and it emphasizes integration, all these different ways, nonviolence. And the Milwaukee campaign kind of challenges all of those along the way in important ways, which are important about Milwaukee specifically, but they're just more important about how we understand the movement era broadly, even when we think about the South, where, you know, nonviolence took place alongside throughout armed self-defense. And for instance, it didn't all go down in churches or Baptist churches either. You know, so there's, I think that problematizing of the way the popular story of the movement happens is really key in understanding what exactly went down and what kinds of lessons we should be taking from this history and how this can be a usable past to us. And it just opens fantastic ways for students and classrooms to think into that complexity about, you know, these are not parallel lines like integration on one hand and Black Power on the other hand, that these things were intertwined together, and the very same people often at the same time articulated things we might call and put in the column of integrationism and also Black Power stuff. You know, that these things were not, you know, separate and distinct, but tied together, and they were created by locality and changing and used by activists as they needed them in the moment as well. And I think that figure of Black Power or Father Grappi and Black Power and the Commandos and Youth Council is really an important one and rich as well, because we've got the Commandos who are, you know, men, and there's a real emphasis on raising up a new generation of Black men in leadership roles. But in the Youth Council, you know, it's mainly young women, and there's this important place of young women in the Milwaukee movement too. And then you have Vel Phillips also, and her important and courageous institutional leadership, which then blends over as she comes down in marches too. So, you know, there's gender stuff going on here, there's race stuff going on here, there's class stuff between middle class African Americans and more working class African Americans that are just blurring a lot of these lines. And then Father Grappi himself, you know, I love to tell the story of when they went to Washington, and activists are trying to raise up the issue of housing nationally for a national law, and they invite Milwaukee to come, and Grappi and Commandos go, and they're confronted by a group of local Black Power advocates in Washington, D.C., and they call the Milwaukee Commandos out for being what they say is led by a white man. And Grappi doesn't respond himself. He kind of goes to the side of the room, and the Commandos, these young African-American men, step forward and articulate how they are Black Power and what Black Power means to them, that it is church-based, that it is an interracial movement there, but it's also militant, and they practice armed self-defense, meaning not with guns, but that they're willing to fight back with their fists, and that Grappi is legit because it's not about, as Dick Gregory is going to emphasize, you know, the color of your skin, but about your consciousness and your willingness to be there with the struggle, and that Grappi had proven that and demonstrated that. So it's raising, you know, Black Power is a debated issue at the time, and it continues to be. And the Milwaukee movement really raises these interesting questions about what is it, who can it be, who can be it, you know, and in it, and what does it mean to have a militant movement in the urban North.
You know, we've got a couple questions to these exact points. One of which one of our attendees wants to know, were there similar developments happening in Milwaukee such that, like in the South, folks would come from different parts of the country to take part? Do we have here in Milwaukee a similar kind of experience where folks from different parts of the country would come and take part in our movement?
Yeah, that's one of the notable things, and it's one of the things that connects to the Southern movement in some ways. Father Grappi and several members of the commandos and youth councils had gone south in support of earlier campaigns during Freedom Summer and voting rights campaigns, and most notably for Grappi, the Selma voting rights campaign, and had learned about kind of militant nonviolence and a confrontational nonviolence, and brought it back and tried to adapt that into a Northern context. And when they had those first few nights of marches and went across the viaduct and elicited such massive white reaction, like Dr. King had done in Selma, Father Grappi and others in the movement put out an ecumenical call, national call, to invite people of conscience to come to Milwaukee to participate in the campaign and to bear witness to what was happening. And hundreds of people did that. It tended to be more, those numbers were higher on weekends. They kept marching every day. So people would come in for weekends, and some would stay for several days at a time, and others for a few days. But yeah, so that's part of what got it national attention and national focus and made it a driving force and ultimately passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968, which I often refer to as the kind of the forgotten third Civil Rights Act of the movement era.